These stories and more are featured in C-SPAN's book, First Ladies, Presidential Historians on the Lives of 45 Iconic American Women. The book makes a great gift for the holidays, giving readers a look into the personal lives of every First Lady in American history, stories of fascinating women, and how their legacies resonate today. Share the stories of America's First Ladies for the holidays. First Ladies, in paperback, published by Public Affairs, is now available at your favorite bookseller and also as an e-book.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
To mark the 75th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, we visited the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, to see a selection of 5 U.S. Navy deck logs from that day. The logs are routine written records of activities and observations on naval ships, but they were anything but routine on the day of infamy.
I am Chris Carter. I am an archivist at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. And today we're going to look at the deck logs of various ships that were located at Pearl Harbor during the attack. A deck log is a recording of all the activities that occurred on a ship in a 24-hour period. This could include any injuries to sailors, any sailors coming on and off the ship, anything according to the ship at the time, so in this instance, the attack on Pearl Harbor. We're going to first look at the USS Chew, which is a destroyer at the time of the battle. One of the older destroyers that we had, it's a World War I era destroyer, meaning it had 4 stacks, 4 smokestacks, and it was a little slower than the contemporary destroyers of the time, which we'll look at some of those. The USS Chew, actually after the attack, was used primarily in an escort role for convoys and things of that nature. So this is what the officers on board wrote on December 7th. Starting at around 6 in the morning, they actually received 10 gallons of milk and 4.5 gallons of ice cream, which was recorded on board, and they brought this on board. And interestingly enough, the next entry located on this deck log is at 7:57, which states, suffered surprise air attack by Japanese torpedo and bombing planes, sounded general quarters and manned anti-aircraft battery. It's kind of a nice juxtaposition between peacetime and then war breaking out. At 8:11, they mentioned that they continued an attack by Japanese bombers and dive bombers. For instance, what ended up happening is, according to this deck log, the 3-inch anti-aircraft gun scored a direct hit on one dive bomber, demolishing the plane in midair. The hit was observed by the executive officer and various members of the crew. They also state that 2 other probable hits were scored, one in the tail assembly of a dive bomber.
Would they have written this that day?
Most likely not. Most likely a lot of these recollections occurred after the fight. At the time, they would have been recording some of the incidents that were occurring, but they were a little preoccupied at the time, trying to fight back and things like that. So for a lot of these records, a lot of these were probably recorded after the fact. Some deck logs, this one not included, will write down the number of casualties, who was killed, who was wounded. Those would not be collected until the end of the attack.
And do you know whose job it was to write these things down? And
yes, the officer on watch is typically the one who does this. It's not the executive officer, the captain, in this case, lieutenant commander. So typically it was an ensign or a lieutenant, junior grade, or a lieutenant, depending on the type of ship, was the one who typically was responsible for writing the entries in the deck log. This is the USS Alwyn. This is actually one of the more modern destroyers at the time of the attack. This ship is notable because it set sail with only 4 officers on board. All 4 officers were ensigns, who are roughly the equivalent of a second lieutenant in the Army. And the most experienced of them had only 8 months of experience. So they actually kind of set sail without any tugs, any pilots on board to help them set sail, and they managed to make it out of the harbor and were patrolling for a day or two until they finally came back in the harbor and picked up everyone else, including their captain. So, and the one fun thing about the deck log is it actually mentions that the captain was trying to catch up to the ship as it was setting sail, but according to the orders of the commander of the destroyer squadron, they were not to pick up any passengers as they were setting sail, so he ended up boarding another ship to attempt to try to board his vessel, but ultimately was not able to until a day or two later. But one entry of note in here, it actually does mention that there was some damage because of the attack, because at 0900, according to the deck log, bomb exploded on port quarter, throwing the stern against a buoy. In their brevity, that's all they mention, unfortunately, but obviously there wasn't enough damage for them to not be able to set sail, because they ultimately set out and were outside patrolling looking for any other Japanese submarines that might have attacked. So,
do they have any other mention of the attack?
let's see here. We have at 9:03 they opened fire with the main battery machine guns on dive bombers coming over Ford Island. According to the deck log, they shot down one plane in flames, which fell on the USS Curtis. And actually, one thing a lot of the deck logs at the time will mention, they will mention either the Arizona burning or blowing up, because that was kind of a notable occurrence at the time. So for instance, in here, it mentions that the Arizona seen burning from stem to stern following explosion. This was shortly after the start of the attack. All right, so the next ship we'll look at is the USS Monaghan. It is another destroyer similar to the Alwyn. So the Monaghan is actually notable because during the time of the attack, one of the Japanese midget submarines was able to successfully penetrate Pearl Harbor. It was sighted by the Monaghan, who then proceeded to ram the submarine and drop 2 depth charges to sink the submarine.
So where were they located physically?
So the destroyers that we've mentioned so far, they all were located in the northeastern portion of the harbor itself, because that's where they stored that's where they docked most of the destroyers. The battleships were, as most people know, docked along Ford Island. So they were on the southeastern section of the harbor itself.
And in general, why were all these ships in Hawaii?
So all these ships were in Hawaii itself because there had been more warnings recently. We were aware that more likely than not we were going to end up fighting the Japanese. So as a way to convince them not to attack us, we had our forward elements of the Pacific Fleet stationed in Pearl Harbor itself. So actually the main portion of the fleet. So 8 battleships and 3 aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet were all based in Pearl Harbor at the time. Fortunately for us, our aircraft carriers were out and about doing various missions at the time of the attack, so we're not present at the time of the attack, and we're relatively unscathed because of it. Here recorded in the deck log at 8:39, the deck log is recorded as saying sighted conning tower of enemy submarine. At 8:40, it says headed for submarine at flank speed to ram. Passed over submarine, dropped 2 depth charges, which exploded at 30 feet depth. Observed 1 torpedo track passing about 50 yards on the starboard beam. And then, unfortunately for them, at 8:43, they backed engines emergency as they struck the dredge that was on the other side of the harbor. And actually, they do record a little bit of the damage that occurred to the ship. But they were, in spite of the damage, still able to get underway, and were another one of the destroyers that were stationed outside of Pearl Harbor to protect against any possible submarine attack. Most entries are arranged in 4-hour time blocks, and so each officer who was in charge of the watch of that time block would typically sign the entry that they wrote up. So the one we were just reading from is J.W. Gilpin. He was an ensign in the U.S. Navy. With the Monaghan, unfortunately, it did not make it to the end of the war, but it was not sunk in enemy action. It actually succumbed to a typhoon in December of 1944 and unfortunately sunk somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. The other two ships, the USS Chew, that had been used for convoy action, the Alwyn was also used in the Pacific Ocean, but as more of a kind of, they were stationed with the fleet itself and served as protection from submarines and aircraft attack. So next we will move to the USS Maryland. It was a battleship that was located at Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack. The Maryland was lucky in that it actually did not suffer a lot of damage during the attack. And part of the reason for that is they were inboard of the USS Oklahoma, meaning the only way the Japanese could hit the USS Maryland was via aerial bombs, whereas the Oklahoma had to suffer air bombardment and torpedo attack. So luckily for the Maryland, the Oklahoma soaked up most of the torpedoes and was actually one of the two battleships that we ultimately lost over the course of the battle, because the Oklahoma ended up capsizing and completely flipped over. So if you see any images of the hull of the ship during Pearl Harbor, that's the ship. So.
And if people are watching this and wondering why aren't we reading the deck logs from the Oklahoma or the Arizona?
So unfortunately we do not have the deck logs from the USS Arizona or the USS Oklahoma, because both were considered sunk at the time of the battle. So for instance, with Arizona, that one most likely either blew up or got burned up in the beginning of the attack, whereas the Oklahoma, as it flipped over, they weren't able to recover the deck log itself, because at the time they were a little more concerned with saving as many men as they could. So it was actually the same thing with the West Virginia as well. The West Virginia, even though we ultimately raised the ship from the bottom, at the time of the attack, since it was docked right next to the USS Arizona, a lot of the oil from the USS Arizona floated down, and there was a lot of flame kind of rising up around the West Virginia, which led to it being abandoned until we were able to quench the flames and go back and refloat the ship. Now, the notable thing about the deck log for the USS Maryland is at the time, it appears that a lot of the radio transmissions went through the USS Maryland, meaning a lot of these radio transmissions were actually recorded in the deck log itself. And what that ultimately means is a lot of the confusion that was occurring at the time of the attack, notably we had no idea where the Japanese were at the time or what they were planning on doing next, kind of lends itself from the deck log itself. So for instance, at 12:01, it's recorded that parachute troops were reported landing at Barber's Point, and enemy tankers were reported 4 miles off of the coast of Oahu. Now, as most people know, that was not the case, but at the time they weren't sure if this air attack was a prelude to something bigger, if they were going to launch an invasion of Oahu itself to completely knock out the naval base. But again, as we know, that was not the case. So, another entry of note is at 11:43, as a part of the further continuation of the confusion, the Maryland writes, report received, enemy troops wearing blue coveralls with red emblems. So not only did we think they were attacking, we knew what they dressed like. So the confusion at the time, they had no idea what was going on. They were trying to send out planes to find where the enemy carriers were, but unfortunately, as the Japanese made sure to destroy as many of the planes as they could before we could have them take off, we didn't have many search planes available at the time. So, and ultimately, when we did think we figured out where the Japanese carriers were, we ended up going 180 degrees in the wrong direction. Because apparently with radio contacts, when you receive it, it's either one way or it's the exact opposite. And we assumed instead of them being to the northwest, we thought they were to the southeast. And so we actually sent one of our carriers down that way to scout to try to find their carriers. But of course, They weren't there. We didn't find them, which in the long run was probably a good thing because we would have been outnumbered 2 carriers to 6. And that would not have ended well, and that would not have ended well for Midway because we needed all the carriers that we had at the time to succeed in that battle.
So, what's the first indicator on this log that something is going wrong?
Let's see here. We have, according to this deck log, at 7:50, Japanese planes commenced bombing attack on yard by dive bombers. And at 7:52, the USS Maryland sounded general quarters. And shortly thereafter, the Maryland records that the Oklahoma, which is the ship right next to it, was hit by an unknown number of torpedoes. As I had mentioned before, they arranged the deck logs in 4-hour time chunks. So in the first time chunk, it's 0400 to 0800. So the next time chunk is where the main attack itself is located. So the 0800 to 1200 chunk. So they mentioned here, moored as before, the commanding officer is restored. They commence getting up steam to try to get underway. And at 8:05, they opened fire with one 1-inch battery and the 50 caliber machine gun. So, like, they were trying as hard as they could to get back to get into the attack, but as it was a surprise attack, it took them a little bit of time. At 8:10, the USS Oklahoma alongside to port, listed to port until lying on starboard side with keel showing. At 8:15, conning tower took steering and engine control. At 8:38, they stood by all lines. At 8:39, all ready boxes refilled. So ready boxes at this time were the boxes that they put all the ammunition in. And this was considered the ready ammunition that they could use for all the various weapons they had on board. At 8:40, received report that an enemy submarine was inside Pearl Harbor. Presumably that was probably the submarine that the Monaghan saw and rammed and then ultimately depth charged. Which is kind of interesting because they must have received that via radio transmission, because since they were on the opposite side of Ford Island, they shouldn't have been able to physically see that. So, and then one of the next entries is actually 8:57, the USS Nevada getting underway, which actually was the first battleship and ultimately the only battleship that got underway during the time of the attack. At 8:58, we have the USS West Virginia settling, fire appearing on or near the USS Tennessee. At 8:59, we have the USS California listing to port. At 0900, we have open fire with remaining anti-aircraft batteries. At 9:09, we have received 1 and possibly 2 bomb hits on the forecastle on a midships line. About frame 10, detailed report of damage to be given later. And about 3 near misses on each side and ahead of the bow. At 9:14, received report of large number of enemy bombers over Pearl. At 9:24, torpedo air compressor was reported out of commission. Lost air pressure on port 5-inch 25 caliber battery. And at the same time, a burning enemy plane fell on the USS Curtis. At 9:25, recommenced firing. At 9:28, slight fire on forecastle and signal bridge broke out. Received report that Rear Admiral Anderson came aboard at 9:05. At 9:30, lull in the attack. At 9:36, Phelps standing out. Additionally, Japanese submarines reported inside and outside of Pearl Harbor. At 9:40, USS West Virginia abandoning ship, 50 caliber machine magazines flooded. At 9:43, turret 3 covered with flames from burning oil on the water. At 9:45, received reports that enemy planes massing south of Pearl Harbor. At 9:47, received from Commander-in-Chief Pacific that all battleships remain in Pearl Harbor until further orders, as the channel was probably mined. At 9:49, patrol bombers taking off. At 9:50, one of the ships sank alongside the 1010 dock. At 9:55, fire under control around quarterdeck. At 10:05, USS Solace underway. USS Shaw in floating dry dock enveloped in flames. At 10:09, commenced firing on enemy aircraft, which probably wasn't the case because all the enemy aircraft at the time were gone. So that was probably a phantom sighting. At 10:12, commenced pumping in forward trunks. At 10:22, floating dry dock sinking. Explosions on the USS Shaw. And at 10:29, report of casualties, including 1 officer dead, 1 enlistman dead, 1 enlistman wounded. At 10:25, you can see an indication that the confusion had already started as parachute troops reported near Barbers Point. At 10:34, submarine reported 10 miles south of Barbers Point. At 10:39, USS Cummings underway. At 10:40, explosion on the USS West Virginia. At 10:44, USS California settling. At 10:51, enemy submarine sighted by the USS Solace. At 10:55, commenced firing on enemy aircraft coming from port side. Then to the next page. At 11:37, parachute troops reported landing on North Shore. At 11:43, report received that enemy troops wearing blue coveralls with red emblems sighted. At 11:45, called away fire and rescue party to assist in the rescue of the USS Oklahoma personnel.
So the parachute was just
It's
a rumor?
most likely what a lot of historians believe happened is we were able to get some planes into the air. Some of them were shot down, and it's presumed that some of those parachutes were probably reports of our pilots actually coming down. So most likely that's what it was, but for certain, no Japanese troops landed at the time of the attack. So next we will take a look at the USS Nevada, which is the only battleship at the time of the attack that was able to get underway. And part of the reason for that is the officer on watch had ordered a second boiler to come online to make it a little easier to transition between having one boiler online to the next. So he was actually just doing it for efficiency's sake. So the USS Nevada was one of the older battleships that we had at the time. It had been built initially around World War I and had been modernized once or twice in the ensuing period. As I mentioned, the USS Nevada had actually gotten underway, but as the second air attack was coming in, as they were the only large vessel underway, the Japanese planes tended to focus on that ship in particular. So there were a lot of near misses, actual hits, and so it looked like the ship could potentially have gone down. And so the admirals at the time decided, okay, well, instead of having this ship potentially block the entrance to the harbor, thereby preventing any other ships from getting out, we'll order it to beach itself. And so we have recorded in here, at 9:05, received signal from commander of the battle force not to proceed out of harbor. They made preparations to anchor, and they stopped engines. At 9:07 is actually an instance where they recorded that they received bomb hit on the forecastle, killing an individual by the name of Hill, who was blown overboard. At 9:10, they were recorded as grounding the bow of the ship intentionally between the floating dry dock and channel buoy number 24 on the starboard side to beach. Ship was recorded as grounding on even keel. And at 9:15, they record that the captain actually returned on board. So this whole time, the captain was not on board issuing any orders, which actually was very typical for most of the ships at the time, because most of the senior officers were on leave because it was Sunday. It was a time of peace. The week before had been the main war warning. And so everyone at the time was expecting nothing to occur. And if anything were to occur, they were expecting it to happen in the Philippines, as that was significantly closer to Japan and therefore was more of a threat. But as we know, unfortunately that didn't happen. They ended up attacking the Philippines, I believe 7 or 8 hours later, and ultimately securing that sometime in 1942. So actually the notable thing about the USS Nevada is at the time of the attack, they were raising colors for kind of they were raising morning colors. And as this was one of the larger ships, they actually had a whole band playing the national anthem. And at the time of the attack, Japanese planes were coming in trying to strafe the band as they're playing the song, and they actually played the song throughout the start of the attack. And it wasn't until they were done with the song that they went and manned their stations. And some of this is actually kind of reflected in the log itself, as at 0800, they made morning colors with guard of the day and bugle. At 8:01, Japanese aircraft commenced a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet present in Pearl Harbor. So as the Nevada was beached, it actually was slightly submerged, so it took a little while before they were able to get to it. But in February of 1942, repair crews actually refloated the ship. They were able to do some minor repairs to it, basically enough to have it sail out, and they sent it to the West Coast to get finalized repairs and to kind of update the armament, mostly including more anti-aircraft batteries, things of that nature. And it ultimately was stationed in the Atlantic Ocean to serve as kind of a fire support role. And actually its most notable role was it served in D-Day off the coast of Normandy and provided fire support, with some shells reported as being sent about 17 miles inland. So,
how many ship logs do we have from Pearl Harbor?
Approximately 90, because I believe there are around 90 ships at the time, including combat and auxiliaries. So theoretically, we should have all of their deck logs, unless, of course, the ship was destroyed, which we do not have the deck logs of the USS Arizona, the Oklahoma, West Virginia, and several destroyers, which were destroyed at the time of the attack.
And then from your point of view, what's the value in preserving documents like this?
So definitely it's valuable at the very least just for the first-hand accounts that we receive. You have from the USS Nevada and especially from the USS Maryland, you can just see at the time the chaos that was occurring. We kind of get an idea of what some people were thinking at the time, what the ships were doing at the time, how we were responding to the attack, and other things of that nature. So for historians, it's a very useful tool just to kind of get an idea of, in this instance, seeing what was happening at the attack on Pearl Harbor. Other folks who might be interested in it too are genealogists, just to see who was located on the ship at the time, who may have passed away and things like that. Yeah, I mean, for instance, on here for the Nevada, pretty much the last entry that they have is at 11:30 at night. They lighted fires underneath boiler number 6 upon completion of overhaul, warming up slowly due to the flooding. And that's pretty much the last order that they had on that particular day. So.
Can you tell us about how they're saved and how you know where to find them?
Of course. So they are located in one of our stacks. They're arranged in 5 or 10 year chunks. They're under by month. And so if you want to come here, just talk to our reference staff in the textual research room, room 2000, and you can ask them, we would like a certain month for a certain ship, and if we have that log, we'll be able to provide it for you.
How far back in history do these things go, and do they still do them now?
So the deck logs that we have here at the National Archives in College Park, we have 1941 deck logs on. So currently we have the 1941 to 1983 deck logs. Downtown in Washington, D.C., we have the deck logs prior to 1941. The Navy is still currently creating deck logs for the foreseeable future. So.
Saturday, December 10th, beginning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, we'll be live to take your calls and tweets for Ian Toll, author of Pacific Crucible, War at Sea in the Pacific, 1941 to 1942. That's live next Saturday here on American History TV.
Sunday on American History TV on C-SPAN 3. At 1 p.m. Eastern, a symposium on World War II spies and codebreakers. the FBI in a Nazi spy ring in New York City, and an American family who aided the French resistance in Nazi-occupied Paris.
The decision to join the resistance was a very serious one, obviously. She had a husband, Sumner Jackson, and she had a 15-year-old son, Philip Jackson. So by deciding to use 11th Avenue Foch as a place where the resistance could meet and where intelligence was dropped, she was risking not only her life, but her husband and her son's life.
And a little after 5, in the 1920s, Italian-American anarchists Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were tried, convicted, and executed for robbery and murder in Massachusetts, despite the lack of supporting evidence. Law professor Brad Snyder discusses the controversy surrounding the case inside the Supreme Court chamber, with introductions by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
At 9:10 p.m. on August 3rd, Sacco and Vanzetti were transferred to the death house. The governor, after reading the unanimous Lowell Committee report, declared that Sacco and Vanzetti had had a fair trial. The Boston Press declared the case closed.
And at 8, on the presidency, historian George Nash talks about Herbert Hoover's humanitarian efforts during World War I and II.
In the course of these exertions, Hoover, working voluntarily and without pay, became an international hero, the embodiment of a new force in global politics, American benevolence in the form of humanitarian aid programs.
For our complete American History TV schedule, go to cspan.org.
Japanese torpedoes capsized the USS Oklahoma within 10 minutes during the Pearl Harbor attack of December 7, 1941. The ship suffered 429 casualties. Only 35 of the dead were identified. A military board ruled in 1949 that the identities of most of the lost crew were non-recoverable. Their remains were buried in 46 plots at Honolulu's Punch Bowl Cemetery. A 2015 Defense Department order prompted a renewed search for their identities in the hope of returning them to their families. Under the supervision of the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, the remains of the USS Oklahoma crew have been disinterred and sent to laboratories for DNA and other analysis. Just this November, Nebraska's Offutt Air Force Base Laboratory received crew remains in a transfer dictated by military protocol. Navy Fireman 3rd Class John H. Lindsley, who was 22 in 1941, is one of the 49 members of the Oklahoma's crew who have now been identified. This October, as Pearl Harbor's 75th anniversary neared, he was laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. We'll see that ceremony in a few minutes, followed by an interview with his niece, who herself is a Navy veteran. First, an interview with Todd Leivik of the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency.
You know, the Navy has a great tradition, and a lot of what the Navy does is that when a ship goes down in water, that becomes the final resting place and the formalized resting place for those sailors and Marines, much like the sailors and Marines on the USS Arizona. However, with the Oklahoma, they were interred at the Punch Bowl, primarily because graveside grave registration was able to bring them up because it really wasn't that deep of water. But we did not have the capabilities in the 40s to have DNA so that we could identify who they were. So that's why they were interred into the Punch Bowl.
What changed in 2015? Why was there a decision made to disinter the remains?
That's a great question, and it actually took a few years, and it went through the Navy, the formal Navy process, and then it went to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And the Secretary of Defense actually authorized the disinterment. And once the disinterment process was authorized by the Secretary, then two more things have to happen. First thing is we then coordinated with the state of Hawaii to make sure that we could go in and environmentally do the right thing at the Punch Bowl. And then we coordinated with the Department of Veterans Affairs because it's their cemetery and they run the cemetery. And then once the date was set and we started the disinterment process, it took about 6 months and I believe it was 61 caskets that were in 45 grave sites.
Where were the remains taken?
Initially, they were taken to our lab in Hawaii, and then later transferred to our lab in Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska. And then for a lot of the DNA work that we did, it was sent to the Armed Forces DNA Identification Lab in Dover, Delaware.
And what is the process in terms of trying to identify the remains and getting them home to their families?
The process, first off, once they're in the lab, they go through the identification process. And then we also work with families to get their family reference samples so that we can help with the matching of the DNA. But then once the process moves through and a sailor or Marine is identified, in this case in the USS Oklahoma, then we work, do the lab report, the medical report, and then we work with the Service Casualty Office. And for this one, or the majority, is worked with the Navy. And then what the Navy will do is that Service Casualty Office will reach out to the family, explain the situation, and we can make that identification and that we've accounted for their loved one over the phone. And then over the course of probably the next month or two, they'll get the formal paperwork so that they can make the determination, make the decision of where they want their loved one, his final resting place to be.
And of course DNA is what makes this possible. To identify the remains. And in addition to the DNA, do you use other evidence to try to make a confirmation?
We do. And some of the, what we use is the clavicle, because what we found with clavicles is it's much like a dental record. And a lot of service members in World War II, that they would take the chest x-ray. So we would have that to go back and we could reference that if it was on file. So, but I think in the case here, the majority of those that we've identified to date have been through DNA and family reference samples that were given by families to match up and make sure that we have identified. And to date, we've identified nearly 43.
From the USS Oklahoma?
From the USS Oklahoma, from the 2015 disinterment. And I would anticipate of the 388, so you subtract the 43, I would say probably about 20% will probably want to be buried here in Arlington.
What is behind the desire to be buried at Arlington?
Well, duty, honor, service. I mean, this says it all right here. I mean, there's not every time that I come into this cemetery, just my chest swells. For a matter of fact, one day I might even be buried here. And it's just that reflection. I think it's a symbol that the family can take away. One, that they know that their family member's been accounted for, and two, they know their family members will be taken care of, for eternity. So I just think that's a wonderful message. And again, with the way the full military honors, every time I hear taps, and then when they do the 21 gun salute, it's amazing, and I can't help but to tear up every single time that I hear that.
John Lindsley, whose burial was today, how recently was he identified?
Within the last 6 months. So then the process, like I said, with the Service Casualty Office, then we go through the steps on what the family's wishes are, and then the coordination has to be made with Arlington for the services.
If you're thinking about all of the wars that this country has fought, is there a rough number of how many service people still remain unaccounted for?
Believe it or not, and I was shocked when I heard this, it's nearly 83,000 that are still unaccounted for. And the majority of those, it's 73,000 from World War II. And the majority of those 73,000, about 50,000 are deep sea losses. And the being real and honest, those are going to be very tough, if not impossible, unless, of course, technologies as we move forward with deep sea losses. But again, the Navy, the Navy has it, and it's very formalized, that if a ship goes down, then that is the final resting place for those sailors and Marines on board.
Please stand behind the second row chair of the procession. Come forward.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
My name is Catherine Lindsley Caney, and I am the niece of John Lindsley. He is my father's brother, one of 4 boys, all of whom were in the Navy. And all 4 boys are parents. Mother was one of the first Navy nurses, and the father was in the Navy as well. And then my own mother was a Navy nurse, and I'm a 3rd-generation Navy nurse. So,
do you know how it was that he came to join the Navy?
I don't know that, except for that since both of his parents were in the Navy, I think it was encouraged in the family.
How did the family learn that he'd been killed at Pearl Harbor?
I honestly don't know the answer to that.
Did you hear any family stories growing up about him?
I didn't. There were no family stories about either my Uncle John or my Uncle Edgar, who also died during World War II at Okinawa. I think the surviving brothers were so dismayed by what had happened, they just never wanted to discuss either of them.
Do you remember when you first became aware of him?
Probably about 10 years ago, actually.
And when were you first notified by the government that there was an attempt to try to identify him?
About 2 years ago, we started getting communications from volunteer genealogists who were doing some of the footwork in advance of the genetic work, trying to find families. And that's when we became aware of the fact that they were looking for matriarchal DNA to identify remains, which do not exist in our family. And so actually it's my cousin, who's a male, whose DNA was used in the identification process.
And I understand also that there were some dental records that were used. Was that provided by the family?
Actually, dental records were not used in identification. They used a tooth as a source of DNA. But the forensic pathologists that managed the whole identification process around Pearl Harbor declined using dental identification because the remains were all disassembled. So identifying a skull didn't mean that you necessarily had the rest of the body to go with it. And she felt that that was an inappropriate thing to do for mothers and fathers who are waiting for their sons' remains.
You yourself were in the Navy. Can you tell us about your service?
Actually, I was a Navy nurse, and I went into the Navy at Great Lakes Naval Station in Waukegan, Illinois, where my father's family lived for so many years. And I was on active duty for about 3 years as a nurse stationed there.
What does it mean to you to have your uncle's remains identified and brought here to Arlington nearly 75 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Because we weren't alive when my uncle died, I don't know how his service was honored. And as a result, I actually feel that we as a family are honored to help in providing or requesting certain activities be done to make sure that he is for certain honored. And long after we will all be gone, his remains are here in Arlington for future generations to appreciate.
Was it the family's decision that he be buried here at Arlington?
Yes, it was.
And why did you make that decision?
The mother and father are buried in Waukegan, Illinois. None of us live near there. There's no other family there to go to the graveside. And again, I think interment here at Arlington and all that goes with it is something extra special for somebody who has given his life, and particularly at Pearl Harbor. Really important for us to see that he was honored this way.
Saturday, December 10th, beginning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, we'll be live to take your calls and tweets for Ian Toll, author of Pacific Crucible, War at Sea in the Pacific, 1941 to 1942. That's live next Saturday here on American History TV.
Sunday on American History TV on C-SPAN 3. At 1 p.m. Eastern, a symposium on World War II spies and codebreakers, the FBI and a Nazi spy ring in New York City, and an American family who aided the French resistance in Nazi-occupied Paris.
The decision to join the resistance was a very serious one, obviously. She had a husband, Sumner Jackson, and she had a 15-year-old son, Philip Jackson. So by deciding to use 11th Avenue Foch as a place where the resistance could meet and where intelligence was dropped, she was risking not only her life, but her husband and her son's life.
And a little after 5, in the 1920s, Italian-American anarchists Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were tried, convicted, and executed for robbery and murder in Massachusetts, despite the lack of supporting evidence. Law professor Brad Snyder discusses the controversy surrounding the case inside the Supreme Court chamber, with introductions by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
At 9:10 p.m. on August 3rd, Sacco and Vanzetti were transferred to the death house. The governor, after reading the